they trace back to Poyos, and the laundry, they trace back to Madrigal, and they're going to get picked up by the police. And when they get picked up and threatened with prosecution, and there's only one way out for them, they're going to...
Ever wondered why Gus Fring, the most calculated man in television, refused to launder Walter White's money? The answer reveals everything about how his empire really worked. For a man so obsessively careful he could probably hear a fingerprint forming, Gustavo Fring was never going to make Walter White or Jesse Pinkman official employees. The very notion of laundering their millions through Madrigal or Los Pollos Hermanos reads like an accounting horror story, an extra risk that Fring, of all people, would never take. When Mike Ehrmantraut asks Lydia Rodarte Quayle to launder his money through Madrigal, she practically breaks into hives. She tells him point blank that it's a favor, something she's never done for Gus before. Translation? This was not standard procedure. It was a desperate exception. Gus kept his legitimate empire and his meth empire hermetically sealed. Two halves of a portfolio that were never supposed to shake hands. The fried chicken stayed fried chicken. The meth stayed in the basement. This, of course, raises the question. How did Gus's men handle their own dirty cash? Victor, Tyrus, and the rest of the crew presumably didn't have corporate retirement plans or matching 401ks. The most plausible answer is also the simplest. Fring paid them, and what they did with that cash wasn't his concern. Criminals, after all, are not famous for their long-term financial planning. Hoarding cash in barrels or floorboards tends to be more their speed than setting up offshore LLCs and balancing tax ledgers. If Gus's operation had been a Soprano-style no-show job arrangement, everyone would have had tidy W-2s and a fake desk somewhere. But Gus was far too smart to officially combine crime with his legal businesses. Putting meth money on Los Pollos tax records would be the corporate equivalent of writing meth products in the memo line of a check. It's safer, elegantly ruthlessly safer, to keep the drug side of the operation cash-based and invisible. Mike's legitimate employment was a front for proximity, not accounting. His paycheck as a Madrigal security consultant explained his presence around Fring's distribution centers. It wasn't meant to explain the money he wasn't declaring. Gus's legitimate infrastructure existed to move meth, not to launder its profits. Those were two distinct services, and Fring wasn't in the business of providing the latter. And why would he? Laundering someone else's money means linking your clean companies to their dirty profits. It's not generosity. It's exposure. Walt and Jesse's fortunes were their own problem, and both were supposed to remain temporary fixtures anyway. Gus viewed them as highly disposable subcontractors, a math teacher moonlighting as a meth cook, and his dropout assistant. Hardly worth a paper trail. Even if Gus had wanted to set them up with fake corporate titles, the logistics collapse under the slightest scrutiny. What job could possibly justify Walter White's $1 million monthly earnings? Head of chicken science? Executive Vice President of detergent efficacy? The IRS may be slow, but even they would notice a fast food chemist with a 7-figure salary and no patents to his name. And as for Jesse Pinkman, what would his resume even say? Junior meth technician, former skateboarder, occasional hostage. The only way Gus could make Jesse's income look legitimate would be if Los Pollos suddenly opened a line of luxury sports cars and Jesse became director of Vibe. Better then to let the two cooks quietly sit on their money and hope they didn't buy matching Bentleys before tax season. The irony is that Fring, the great master of order, was not a universal provider. His meticulousness had boundaries. His employees' financial hygiene wasn't his problem. When Mike's people were eventually caught, it wasn't the drugs that did them in. It was their secret, undeclared accounts. They'd taken the money and spent it without laundering it, which left a trail bright enough for the DEA to follow. The only reason Mike avoided the same fate was that he'd never touched Kaylee's offshore account. In that sense, Gus's empire was structurally sound, but morally indifferent. He gave his people the money. He did not give them the tools to clean it. It's not negligence. It's insulation. Every man for himself keeps the boss untouched. The hindsight temptation, of course, is to imagine a cleaner, corporate version of this system. By the time Breaking Bad introduces Madrigal as the omnipotent German conglomerate behind Los Pollos, it's easy to retroactively picture Gus as a smooth corporate operator, handing out ghost paychecks and shell company shares. But that's an illusion of narrative coherence, not reality. When Gus first appeared in Season 2, Madrigal didn't even exist in the writer's room. He was simply the mysterious, polite restaurant owner with unnerving composure. The intricate global connections came later, retrofitted with admirable precision by Vince Gilligan and Peter Gould. What looks, in retrospect, like a seamless master plan was actually careful post hoc gardening. By Season 3's Kafkaesque, the El Pollo Hermanos trademark scrolls by on a TV commercial, officially owned by Madrigal Electromotive. Suddenly, Gus wasn't the sovereign. He was the franchisee of a faceless megacorp, a mid-level crime executive rather than the kingpin he appeared to be. The later introduction of Lydia in Madrigal's laundering network in Better Call Saul was not an extension of Gus's generosity, but a timeline correction. By then, it was too late to retrofit Walt and Jesse into the same system. Gus's dead cooks didn't need payroll titles. And as for Walter White himself, his alleged fall from Caltech prodigy and co-founder of Gray Matter to high school chemistry teacher remains the show's most gaping, logical sinkhole. The resume reads like a fever dream. Brilliant chemist, partial architect of Nobel-winning research, co-founder of a billion-dollar company. Then, high school lab instructor making $67,000 a year and scrubbing car washes for extra cash. The in-universe explanations never quite add up. Walt, we're told, walked away from Gray Matter for emotional reasons and sold his third of the company for $5,000, roughly the price of a used Honda Civic. He then worked briefly at Sandia and Los Alamos, both prestigious national labs, where a man without a PhD would be a glorified lab technician, not a lead researcher. This demotion from near genius to scientific peon likely shattered his ego, and the only place left where he could play God again was the classroom. That regression, once a rising star, now lecturing bored teenagers about covalent bonds, is precisely what fuels Walt's bitterness and his grand delusion of breaking bad. It's not that he couldn't have gotten a better job, it's that he couldn't accept being less than the genius he imagined himself to be. The man peaked early, academically and emotionally, and never recovered. If one wants a real-world analog, look no further than Ronald Wayne, the forgotten third co-founder of Apple, who sold his 10% share for $800 and vanished from tech history. Walt is that man's tragicomic cousin, the ghost of potential, haunted by what could have been, wielding his brilliance as both justification and weapon. So yes, Gus could have fabricated a cushy Madrigal title for Walter. Senior Vice President of Chemical Development sounds plausible enough on paper. But Gus didn't trust him. More importantly, he didn't like him. Walt was a volatile egotist, brilliant but impossible. A man who would have found a way to turn even a fake paycheck into a complaint form. Why am I being taxed at the highest bracket on imaginary income? You can practically hear him ask it. For Gus, the math was simple. Every legitimate tie to Walt was a liability. The cleaner move was to keep his meth cooks as nameless ghosts, paid well, but invisible. No fake jobs, no paper trail, no connection that could be subpoenaed. In the end, it's fitting that Walt's downfall was not only moral, but bureaucratic. The man who could outwit gangsters and blow up drug lords was still undone by the oldest American problem in the book: taxes. If he'd just watched Ozark, he might have known better. Gus Fring's refusal to launder money for Walter White wasn't negligence. It was strategy. Every part of his operation was designed for plausible deniability. Walt and Jesse were never employees. They were volatile assets. The Chicken Man didn't need to wash their money. He needed to keep his hands clean. And for a man who built an empire on fried food and untraceable cash, he did exactly that. Right up until the moment Walter White's ambition turned the fryer into a fireball. Clean operations, dirty truths. Subscribe.